I had no idea that slavery existed. 5 years ago, I had no idea. For the last 30 years, I've been documenting indigenous people in more than 100 countries on 6 continents. My entire vocation is based on seeing, on observing, and yet I hadn't seen it. It wasn't until 2009 that I learned. Now, I'd known about sex trafficking, but at the time I didn't equate that with slavery, nor the fact that there were so many other forms of forced labor. In fact, more than 30 million people are enslaved in the world today. And I have to tell you, it hit me like a freight train. I thought, how could this be? Wasn't this already taken care of in the 1800s? In fact, more than double the amount of people are enslaved today, more than double the amount of those taken during the entire transatlantic slave trade from Africa. How could I have not known? And if I don't know, how many other people don't know? Well, it touched me so that within weeks, I had this idea. I know in my heart of hearts that if we can see one another as fellow human beings, then it becomes very difficult to tolerate abuses like slavery. And I want to shine a light on the truth, because only then is it possible to make change. I knew that if I went out into the world and I photographed people in their dignity, which is my life's work, no matter how dire their situation or the environment in which they are forced to do horrible things, that if I made those images and brought them home and shared them with people like you, that you would bear your own relationship with that image and therefore the human being in that image, who frankly could be any one of us. And photography, by its purely visual nature, transcends language. So I can show that work anywhere in the world, and people could be viscerally responsive to it. Well, that is how my journey began into modern-day slavery. Ironically, many of the places that I would be visiting, I had been to many times before. Some I even considered like a second home to me. But this time, I would be lifting up the rug and going in the back closets and in the back rooms and seeing horrible things. But I invite you today on this journey. I'm going to share with you some of the work I've done, some of the forced labor, and hope that you are touched by them. In India and Nepal, I was introduced to the brick kilns. Imagine walking into something that's like Dante's Inferno or ancient Egypt, where people repeatedly stack bricks on their heads, one at a time, up to 18, each one weighing more than 4 pounds. Imagine walking to trucks hundreds of yards away with that load on your head, only to return back again to the brick kiln and do it again and again and again. Imagine being in 130 degrees Fahrenheit while you're doing this without breaks. One is so dehydrated, frankly, there's no time or liquid for urination. It was so hot, in fact, that I couldn't touch my camera after some moments, and it stopped working altogether. So every 15 minutes, I would have to run back to the cruiser, have the driver turn on the ignition so that I could place my camera under it to revive it back to working again. And I sat there thinking, my equipment is getting far better treatment than these people ever will. There's an endless to it. People are cloaked in this dust that becomes like a garment on them. And there's just wall after wall of bricks to deal with. On Lake Volta, It's estimated that more than 4,000 children are enslaved in fishing villages. When we first arrived, I got out of the cruiser with some fellow abolitionists of that area that were my guardians, my translators, my everything, really. And I looked out to this beautiful lake and saw what appeared to be a family fishing. Well, the fellow next to me shook me and said, "Lisa, no, that's not a family fishing. Those people are slaves." And I thought, oh my God, it's in plain sight, right in front of me. And yet I had failed to see it, of course. People that work on Lake Volta are forced to work so many hours a day in the water that they often incur skin diseases and ailments. They love working with children. Children can pull out small fish from the nets. I met these children at 5 in the morning, but they had been working since 1 a.m., pulling in these huge nets full of fish, so many of them. And when those nets are full, they weigh more than 1,000 pounds. Children who are never taught how to swim are forced to work on the lake. And since Lake Volta is a man-made lake, the trees come up from beneath the surface of the water. And frequently, the nets get tethered from the limbs under the water. So they literally toss the children into the lake to untie the nets. And you can imagine that some of them drown. And in fact, every child that was enslaved that I met knew another child, his or her own age, who had drowned. Imagine being stolen from your parents, being forced to work on water when you don't know how to swim, and housing in you the knowledge that your friend or brother or sister had drowned. But there's hope. I want to introduce you to Kofi, one of my favorite people. He embodies all the children of the world to me. He had been rescued from Lake Volta, and he was in a shelter that rehabilitates victims of slavery. For indeed, he had to learn how to be human again. He had to learn how to play. He had to learn how to just be with himself instead of constantly busying himself with tasks because it was so forced upon him by slaveholders. I made this image behind the shelter where there's a well and all the children bathe themselves, so they have these big buckets of water that they pour over their heads. And they were all giggling and having such fun. But the most wonderful thing is that today, Kofi has been reunited with his parents. All I can think of is who will Kofi become? Because someone took a stand for him. In another part of Ghana, I worked in illegal gold mines. These deep shafts go down into the earth hundreds of feet, and they're held up by mere tree limbs. So while those with me, the abolitionists, remained at the surface of the ground, I descended down these shafts with 5 other people that were enslaved. And all we had were these flickering, cheap flashlights tethered to our heads with these tattered elastic bands. I remember descending down, and I couldn't see very much, but I could feel the sweat of bodies passing me. And I could hear the cacophony of men coughing. And I could hear these primitive tools hitting the sides of that shaft. When we were down 200 feet, I asked these very gentle souls if they would be so kind as to remove their headlamps to shine it on this fellow's face so that I could gather enough illumination to make an exposure. This was made 4 years ago, and this fellow was my age, and still is if he is alive anyway. And I look at him as this angel in the darkness. These people are forced to remain beneath the ground for 48 to 72 hours at a time. Can you imagine having to carry up a bag of stone from which you had pulled off the walls with your primitive tools, climb up that huge ascent of a shaft on limbs, knowing that the belly of the earth is so hot that everything is slippery from human sweat and the moisture of the earth. One false move, and people fall countless feet to their death. In fact, when they come out of the shafts, it looks as though they've been in the rain or come out of some body of water, but indeed it is only their sweat. Those stones are then transported to another site, which is known as a pounding site. And the people there have these metal big shafts that they pound on the stone to turn it to powder. Some of them appear like these amazing Adonises, strong, capable. But I can assure you that it's very likely within 2 years that he will become so frail and fragile and very likely have some sort of lung disease or tuberculosis. And no one is exempt. So there are children as well. And you could see here the gold powder on his hands. I want to shine a light on slavery. When I was in the field, I did 2 things. I photographed people in their very intense forced labor. And I also brought a bundle of candles. And when it was safe for them and it was safe for me, I made these portraits. They knew that their image would be seen by people like you. I wanted them to know that we will all be seeing them and that we will do all we can to help them and to understand their plight. These images are not of issues. They are of human beings like you and me, all deserving of the same dignity and simple humanity that we all deserve. There isn't a day that goes by that I don't think of these many mistreated people I've had the tremendous honor of meeting. I want to shine a light on the truth, because it is only then that we have the power to change our world. Won't you join me? Thank you.